This is a presentation on small-scale residential infill from the Department of Planning and Urban Design. We are sharing with the public first considerations for potential changes to the city's regulations in order to allow for more small-scale neighborhood contextual infill residential development. So why are we looking at changes to the zoning for residential districts? Here are some of our policy directives. The most recent include the City Council's 2036 vision, with some of the key words highlighting abundant, diverse, innovative housing choices, affordable housing, and historic preservation, or trying to maintain the community character within residential districts. The Affordable Housing Advisory Committee is recommending that we research the barriers to developing an increased number of multifamily rentals and ownership units. The comprehensive plan addresses the need to find compatible infill development in order to provide more housing and to do it in a way that addresses the current challenges but to learn from the past. The city also has a document that was developed by the Center for Neighborhood Technology that highlights the need for the city to revise the city code through the UDO in order to allow for more compact mixed income development, especially in order to move away from the standard of single-family residential uses, which primarily dominate our current zoning code. The situation in Asheville today is very different from even 10 years ago. There is a lot of housing pressure. The housing supply is limited. There is less than a 1% vacancy rate for rental housing. The population is growing, and the considerations that we are discussing aim at providing more flexibility to address the housing needs of today. The Asheville Housing Sampler shows a variety of the building types in Asheville. Most of us are used to the single-family detached homes because the single-family detached homes are the most common in the city. But there are many other housing types, some of which use land much more efficiently, especially these small-scale multifamily. We have single-family attached. Those are homes that share common walls on their separate pieces of property. There are duplexes that share common walls, but they also share a parcel of land. And then there are many different types of multifamily. So we want to investigate where small-scale multifamily is appropriate and how it can be very contextual and add diversity to neighborhoods. So a little bit about Asheville's history in housing. In the 1800s, the land pattern was quite dense. This was before the automobile came about, and so near downtown, the land was used quite intensely. Then the streetcars come about in the late 1800s, and it becomes more easy to build on larger lots that are further away from downtown. So we see the introduction of automobiles and the streetcars, and land uses become less efficient. If we look at the early plats, so these are subdivisions of larger tracts of land. This one is dated April 1924. One thing that's visible pretty quickly is that the parcels were relatively small, some of them significantly smaller than what is allowed today. This is in West Asheville, and some of the lots measure only 25 feet along the street. The bulk of them are closer to 50 feet though. So there was a larger variety in the size of parcels, especially on the small scale. But there was another interesting thing, which is that within these residential districts, you had buildings that looked like this. They were not very different from the residential single-family buildings, but they actually housed more than one family. In this case, this is I believe it's a 10-plex, 10 units on a similar size parcel. So we saw multifamily on a very small scale in old neighborhoods dispersed throughout the community. This was a part of Asheville's fabric. This is a 4-plex, and seen from the street, someone walking by would probably think it's a single-family home. This was a common part of our history, and multifamily housing was permitted in all residential districts. And the multifamily was small scale. So this is what we're looking at and trying to find out why was this permitted before, but it's so much more difficult today, because it seems like it's a very appropriate building type for other neighborhoods or for anywhere in Asheville. If we look at the older zoning code from the 40s, we also find that lots were more compact. From the view on the right here in the plan view, you can see the buildings. They look like they're somewhat close, and it might seem crowded when looking at it from the bird's eye view, but if you're on the street, it's actually very attractive. The buildings are closer together so that the neighborhood is more walkable, and these are the neighborhoods that today are attractive and highly sought after. So this is the direction that we're looking at providing incentives for, which isn't to say that Asheville will necessarily get here, but this is the type of density that we're trying to move toward. So what happened between 20s and today? Really, the automobile becomes predominant, so land uses, we sort of spread out throughout the city. And the zoning changes in a similar fashion so that it starts to separate uses. And we all know that there are plenty of good things that came out of zoning, for example, separating noxious land uses such as industrial and manufacturing from residential properties. That made sense that people didn't want to smell pollution and hear the noise. But what also happened was that residential uses were separated from each other. So the multifamily units, the small scale multifamily that earlier were permitted in all residential districts became separate, and the city rules in the 50s or 60s started to isolate multifamily only to certain parts of the city, such that today multifamily is only permitted in 1/3 of the residential property. So when we look at the neighborhoods today to compare them to our current zoning, we did some analysis looking at the general neighborhood boundaries. This was data that we collected from neighborhoods themselves, and this is data that is constantly in flux because neighborhoods themselves are changing boundaries to some extent. But we looked at those neighborhoods, we tried to photo archive some of the context from the street, so what these neighborhoods look like. And then we looked at the zoning regulations to understand what's currently permitted and to compare that to what the actual situation is within those districts. So in this image in Norwood Park, on the right-hand side, you see that the zoning district is called RS8, where the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet, and the residential units that are permitted per acre is 8. And if you go down, you see that the average lot size, so what's actual in this district, the average lot size is 7,000 square feet. So the lots are 40% larger than are permitted, and the actual density is 20% less than is allowed. And this is one of the denser neighborhoods in the city. The next example is Haw Creek, where the minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet, and you can see that the average lot size in Haw Creek is 3 times that. So the land is used much less efficiently in some parts of the city, such as in Haw Creek, where the density is also 1/2 of what is permitted. One of the immediate differences you notice when comparing a very low density neighborhood to a slightly higher density neighborhood, like 5 Points, is that there are sidewalks, it's easier to walk around, and you can see buildings and homes closer to each other. In most cases, these still have plenty of room for gardens and plants and trees, but the landform is a little bit more compact. So we're looking at how to provide some more flexibility to allow greater density. In considering proposals for changing residential districts, we understand that everybody has a different perspective on density. We're hoping that with these considerations, we are being appropriate in understanding the situation that we're in the housing crunch, and trying to provide some flexibility, but not going overboard. We understand that some people will think the proposals may be too much, and some people will say that we're not doing enough. We're trying to find what is just right. And everything we're proposing, we believe to be appropriate for where we are today and responsive to the needs of this community that's growing. This image shows the current regulations for residential zoning districts. Broadly, you can see that in the lowest density residential district, the minimum lot area is 20,000 square feet. It's quite high. In the denser residential districts, we have a smaller lot requirement. And this is a visual on lot standards and what does it mean to have an acre site or half an acre site, which is the standard for our lowest density district. The next 2 slides show some analysis looking at the barriers that we face in discussing residential infill. In the 40s, the city's territory was expanding. Today, the situation is quite different. Only a couple years ago, the state revoked our annexation ability, so effectively we have a city boundary that is now fixed. So if we are to grow, we need to do that from within our boundary. In the 1940s, neighborhoods contained varied parcel sizes that were more pedestrian scale and more varied. Over time, those parcels became much more standardized with greater uniformity. In many ways, the 1948 zoning code used land more efficiently than we do today. For example, they had smaller side and rear setbacks in some of the zoning districts, and the minimum lot width standard for their lowest density district was 30 feet less than we have today. So this is just to say that land use became less efficient over time. So we're learning that the 1948 code in many ways used land more efficiently than we're using it today. A very interesting and important change that happened after the 1948 code that probably went under the radar and likely very few people knew about it was that before 1948, multifamily units were permitted in all residential districts. Today, multifamily units are not permitted in the majority of residential districts. 67% of residential land is single family. So this is to say that even small-scale multifamily, triplexes, quadruplexes, buildings that might actually be the same size as a single-family home are not permitted in the majority of residential districts today. Another important consideration for multifamily is that today we require more land to be used for the same number of units that were permitted under an earlier code. For example, a duplex in the 1940s required only 5,000 square feet of land, whereas today it would require twice the amount of land, 10,000 square feet. You can see from this visual that the land requirements for a duplex, a triplex, and a quad under the 1948 code was much more efficient than the land requirement for those same units under today's code. So the zoning code today contributes to more sprawl and is a disincentive for multifamily. For that reason, the city hasn't seen duplexes, triplexes, quadruplexes, and other small-scale multifamily built for quite a number of years. We currently have a disincentive for multifamily. A few of these slides show the background challenges and constraints to building and land development in Asheville. This slide shows that we have significant environmental constraints. Nearly 40% of residential property in the city is subject to steep slope restrictions. That means that a large number of residential parcels have reductions to the number of units that can be built, and they have reduced grading standards in order to protect our watersheds. Similarly, our property is challenged with floodplains. Nearly 1 in 5 parcels are in some way constrained by flooding issues. Here we also see that residential property is about 52% of city land. This image highlights those residential districts by their type. We also see the annexation history. This image shows where the city boundaries were at a certain year. In the inner circles, the city was quite small in the early 1900s, but then as it changes to orange colors, we enter the 1950s, and then the purple is the 1970s. So this image just shows the history of the expansion of the city as it grows and as automobiles and automobile culture sort of takes off and uses land less efficiently. About 3% of parcels in the city do not have street frontage. These are old parcels, some of which were created before standards were set in place. In many cases, they're large tracts of land, but the development costs are more difficult to provide access to them. It's interesting to note that within the housing crisis, there are approximately 10% of our residential parcels that are vacant. This is to say that there is still development opportunity of lots, but some property owners are choosing to not develop those lots at this time. The considerations that we're looking at are broadly put into 2 different categories. One of the considerations would impact all residential zoning districts in this image. That would mean every color, the yellow shaded land and the orange shaded land. And the other consideration is just for the multifamily zoning districts, which are in this image are the orange, which again is only 1/3 of all residential property. So the first consideration for all residential zoning districts is to reduce the minimum lot area and the lot width by 20%. For the majority of properties, this wouldn't change anything. This is really reducing the minimums so that if somebody has a very large parcel and they want to subdivide it, the reduction in the minimum lot area and lot width would give them more flexibility to do this. So this would be an incremental change that would be noticed little by little throughout residential districts over time. We're imagining that over a period of 10, 20, 50 years, a change like this would allow larger parcels to be subdivided so that other homes could be built. And this is a visual for how each district could be affected. So for example, if we look in the center at the RS8 column, for example, this is the residential high-density single-family district, the minimum lot size under this proposal would move from 5,000 square feet to 4,000 square feet, and the minimum lot width would be reduced from 50 feet to 40 feet. Notice that on the bottom here, we're proposing that we would not reduce lot standards for property within the steep slopes. Those are properties above 2,200 feet in elevation with more than 15% grade, with the idea that we don't want to allow more development where the grading and the construction would contribute to more environmental degradation of the land. And some of the potential changes that we would see in Asheville over years would potentially be changes to building types, so that we get more row houses, for example. In this photo, even in a very steep terrain, they fit quite well. This image shows potential for how the reductions in lot standards could affect the building types in Asheville. We currently don't have many row houses. A reduction to the lot standards would incentivize building types like this or clustered homes that are more like townhomes that use land much more efficiently. Our second consideration for all residential zoning districts is called lot area averaging. In this example, the zoning district is RS4, where the minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet. The parcel here is actually twice that, 20,000 square feet. But if this property owner wanted to subdivide, the lot line would be drawn directly over where the house is located. So under today's rules, we would simply tell the property owner that it's not possible to subdivide, even though the property owner has twice the minimum lot area and twice the minimum lot width. So lot area averaging says that as long as you have twice the minimum, we will allow you to subdivide by flexing the minimum size down a little bit. So on an average, we're still meeting our density requirements, but we're giving some flexibility in order to preserve the existing house and to use land more efficiently. Now to the multifamily zoning district considerations. The first one is to incentivize duplexes. This is something that was permitted in the 1948 zoning code in Asheville, but we moved away from it in the 50s and 60s. So what we're saying here is that under current standards, to have a duplex, in this example, you would need to have a 14,000 square foot lot, because the minimum lot size in this district is 7,000 square feet. So our rules say that you need to have the minimum lot size for every unit, and a duplex is considered 2 units. So you need to have twice the minimum lot area. Nevertheless, for a single-family home in the same district, you can have a home and an accessory dwelling unit. So you effectively get 2 units. So what we're saying is, let's go back to an earlier standard that said under the minimum lot size, you could have a duplex by right. So in this case, with 7,000 square feet, you could have that duplex. And what we would hope to see is that more duplexes throughout different residential neighborhoods. These are a few examples that are very contextual. These are examples of duplexes that fit in residential neighborhoods. The second consideration for multifamily zoning districts is to incentivize multifamily. And this is really incentivizing small-scale multifamily. So under current rules, as you can see in the yellow, you really need to have the minimum lot size added for every additional residential unit. So a duplex, in this case, would need 10,000 square feet because the minimum lot size is 5,000 square feet. If you wanted a triplex, you would need to have 15,000 square feet, which is 3 times the minimum lot size. What we're proposing is similar to the 1948 code, where you only had to have an increment of an additional land. You didn't have to have the minimum lot size doubled for every unit. So in this case, for a duplex, you would need to have the minimum lot size and 1,000 extra square feet to have that duplex, which would be 6,000 square feet. For a triplex, you would need an additional 1,000 square feet. For a quadruplex, you would need 8,000 square feet, and so on. It's a more efficient use of land, and in many cases, these buildings would be no larger than what could be built with a single-family home on the same property. Part of the goal with the changes to incentivize multifamily will be to see more varied housing types in Asheville that address what is becoming known as the missing middle, where the intent of changes to multifamily districts are to incentivize more varied housing types. Currently, we have a very large number of single-family detached homes, like you can see here on the far left, and we have apartment complexes shown on the far right. But what we're missing, and what is becoming known as the missing middle, are the many housing types that have sort of disappeared from our city since the 50s. And these are the duplexes, triplexes, and the other small-scale buildings that include multiple units that provide different housing options. And we believe that if we allow for more multi-housing options, we would see more buildings that are contextual, that fit into neighborhoods, but that house more than one family. Our third and last consideration is to require design compatibility for all multifamily. So the idea is that with multifamily, which means 3 or more units, a triplex or above, we could require that projects meet certain design standards. So in this image, we have, for example, a requirement to plant shrubs or trees in front of a multifamily building, or requiring parking to be hidden from the street, to be screened, or to be located in the back of the structure, off of the street view. There are a number of design considerations that we could review, and this list on the left highlights some of the key considerations that we've discussed so far. So what are the next steps? Currently, we have a survey open to the public that's an online survey. You can visit the city's website and go to the Open City Hall portal, which will take you to a survey on these considerations. This is the first part of the conversation that we're having with the public. The next public workshop is scheduled for Thursday, August 11th. It will be held at the U.S. Cellular Center, the second floor banquet hall, from 5:30 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. This is open to the public, and we welcome everybody to participate. Whether or not you understand the issue, we hope to clarify what we're considering, and we welcome anybody, whether you are a homeowner, a renter, a builder, a developer, or just someone who's interested in learning more about what the city is doing. And we hope to get your input. In September, we're proposing to draft some potential 1 or more ordinances to address these issues that we would then take to the Planning and Zoning Commission in October and then to City Council in November. Feel free to email me directly if you have any questions, or to call me at 828-259-5798. You can also visit our website to learn more about this topic.